Has a game or movie ever made you feel an emotion so strong that you just had to stop, take a breath, and then continue? This emotion could be fear, embarrassment, anxiety, a mix, really any emotion where too much of it results in needing a break. Would you say that you had that reaction because the media did a great job? Or because you weren't strong enough mentally to continue without a break? Now, I don't think that question is really as straightforward as I just put it. I know most of the time the answer is probably somewhere in the middle. For me personally, I'm just not that strong in that department. I watch a lot of horror movies with my family, and if something is particularly scary, they've probably noticed I like to hide behind my phone a lot, checking Twitter or something. However, I find if the movie or game does a good enough job with these elements, it's almost like a car crash you can't look away from. Most of the time, I can't stand secondhand embarrassment, yet The Office is one of my favorite shows. And whenever I think about this topic, one game in particular comes to mind. A game that gave me so much anxiety, it actually took me multiple playthroughs over multiple years to actually finish it for the first time. And this game is Subnautica. Subnautica officially came out in January of 2018, but it had been in beta for around 3-ish years before that, and I fell in love with the concept pretty much off the bat. Subnautica took the survival game concept and put it in probably the worst possible location to try and survive: the ocean. And Subnautica pulled it off flawlessly, and while its story is solid and gameplay mechanics are pretty fun, I think the biggest selling point of the game was the fact that it was actually surprisingly terrifying.
The fuck did I just— Oh! Holy shit!
With the game being set almost entirely underwater, the only way to progress in this game is to go deeper. And just like real life, the deeper you go, well, the darker and creepier it gets. Subnautica plays with the feeling of the unknown, and it does so primarily through its atmosphere, instead of just relying on the concept itself. A good example to see the difference is No Man's Sky, which is a game about space. Obviously, we know pretty much nothing about both the Subnautica planet and space, yet No Man's Sky isn't scary, and that's because it doesn't really try to be. The fear of the unknown isn't something that comes out just because something is unknown. I think the atmosphere that Subnautica creates using setup, audio design, and visual design create what makes the unknown so scary. I won't be talking about anything really deep into the story in this video, however, I will be spoiling creatures you'll meet and late game locations. So if you haven't, I obviously really recommend you play this game. I recently beat it for the first time, and it just reaffirmed why I love this game so much, even if I did have such a hard time beating it. Subnautica does atmosphere like nothing I've played, and yet is still visually one of the prettiest games I've played. So let's take a dive into the game that did its job so well, it gave me enough anxiety that I tried and failed 3 different times to beat it.
Launch in 3, 2, 1.
A lot of how atmosphere works in games is by setting up the feeling the game wants a player to feel while playing it. This can be done in a lot of ways, with the most common method being world building, or the setup, showing the player outright how they want them to feel while playing. And from the start, Subnautica makes it clear it wants you to feel alone, and it does this very cleverly through the use of this radio. After crash landing during the start of the game, one of the first things the player will be able to do with minimal exploring is repair the escape pod, and along with it, a one-way radio. You'll immediately get this message, which makes it abundantly clear that you're gonna be here a while.
This is Aurora. Distress signal received. Rescue operation will be dispatched to your location in 9 hours. Continue to monitor for emergency transmissions from other life pods.
And you can't just repair the ship you came here on because, well... At certain key points throughout the game, or when entering certain areas, this notification will pop up to let you know you've got a message on your radio. You can receive 3 different types of transmissions on your radio, but for now I just want to focus on 2 of them, with the first being escape pod distress signals. These transmissions usually lay out who's in the pod, the situation they're in, and where it is, so you can go help them out. One pod even mentions a rendezvous point for survivors. However, going to explore them, you'll realize that every single pod is empty, usually torn open with PDAs left behind behind that either explain what happened or leave it up to you to interpret. Even the proposed rendezvous point is lifeless. The PDA left there explains that only 2 people even made it in the first place, and they are not in the greatest situation.
We were intercepted by a Leviathan-class predator before we could reach the ship. Consider the CTO and I lost at sea. Be safe. Keen. Out.
These discoveries might not seem like much, but constantly being reminded how everyone that even survived the initial crash died keeps the idea that you are alone on this alien planet constantly in your head. It's also a really effective way to raise tension while you're exploring. Since the player has completely ruled out that there are survivors, whatever you hear while exploring, it's not gonna be human. Well, lucky for you, just 9 days into your lovely vacation on planet 4546b, you'll receive a message from a ship called the Sunbeam, responding to the Aurora's distress signal. The pilot, at first, quite rudely does not believe that something bad has happened.
Nothing but vacuum. These Altera ships. They run low on engine grease, send an SOS, you offer to help, they don't pick up.
Thankfully, he realizes his mistake around 4 days later and calls back, telling you that he's coming to pick you up. Around 8 days later, a countdown will start, and you'll be given the location to the Sunbeam landing spot. And hey, look, there's actual land here too! Sucks you won't be able to explore it because the Sunbeam will be here any minute now.
It's coming from the building? Change course. Set thrusters to full.
If my obvious sarcasm didn't give it away, this happens pretty early into the game, so it's pretty obvious something was going to go wrong, but if you did have any hope that maybe you could call for help, well, that's not an option anymore until you figure out what's going on with that massive gun. The radio sets up the game perfectly, with encounters throughout the beginning of the game to make sure you feel alone and helpless, which then raises tension while exploring. It's an aspect of the game I don't think a lot of people pay attention to, but I think it's key for setting up the atmosphere Subnautica is going for. The other thing I wanted to mention in this section is something that sets up the other feeling Subnautica wants you to feel, which is tension, and something in the game that I think is deceptively good at setting up tension is the PDA. You'll get access to the PDA at the start of the game right after you crash land, and it acts as a central point for your survival. It has your inventory, it can show you locations, crafting recipes, and is a source of information displaying any data heard from the radio or data from things you scan. The PDA can also talk to you. It'll randomly comment on stuff when you scan something important, enter a new biome, among other triggers. And it has a type of comment I like to call the "oh fuck, go back" comment, in which it'll say something in order to raise tension in the player. These messages most often trigger when you enter a new biome, and while these messages make me temporarily step back, I think they also cause a bit of curiosity. They are perfect for raising tension and acting as a warning system for the player, making sure you are physically and mentally prepared for some of the more dangerous or creepy areas. And here are just a few of my favorites from the game.
Detecting massive energy signature in the region. Cannot identify. Detecting multiple Leviathan class life forms in the region. Are you certain whatever you're doing is worth it? Biodiversity in this region is unusually low. Cause unknown. Detecting volcanic activity and several unusual electromagnetic signatures in the region. Exercise caution when diving deeper.
This could just be considered good sound design, but since the messages are more for setting up the tone of the areas, and these messages are not the PDA's primary purpose, I decided it would fit better in this section. On the topic of sound design, let's talk about our next section. Now, I'm no sound design expert, but I do think I have the ability to identify why Subnautica's audio works so well, and I think it's mostly due to its connection to the atmosphere of the game. Subnautica's sound design is really good at continuing the tension already set up. As we've established, the game makes you feel hopelessly alone through its setup, and especially in a game where visibility is often low, this can cause you to jump at the slightest sound, because well, you think you're alone, when of course that's not entirely true. The game is populated with an enormous amount of sea life, a lot of which makes sound, and Subnautica does a really good job at making creatures sound specifically. Everything sounds alien, and you can't really tell what is good or bad at first. Take this sound for example. This is the sound of a shuttle bug, which exists in literally every biome in the game, and is completely harmless. Yet upon first hearing it, it's pretty hard to tell if it is. The point being, everything in this game sounds very alien and disturbing. It distorts your view of what's good and what's bad because you have no knowledge of what any sound is. Subnautica's sounds are all extremely unique in a way that makes them a very good warning system while exploring, as not only do they make idle sounds, but they usually have certain sounds for attacking. Take the crab squid for example. It has a very distinct, almost technological sound. And since nothing in the game sounds like it after being attacked by it for the first time, it's pretty easy to steer clear of their areas, as you can usually hear the idle sounds from a good distance away, and its very distinct attacking sound makes it so it's very obvious if it has seen you. And I think this goes for almost every aggressive creature in the game. More often than not, you need that initial panic from the first encounter to attach a sound to a creature in your mind, and along with that sound comes the terror of the first encounter, causing you to steer clear of it, even in the late game when your survival odds have likely tripled since that first encounter. However, some parts of the game do require you to go near these creatures in order to get to certain areas. While navigating these areas, audio is key, and the tension the atmosphere has created combines well with the often quiet nature of these areas, as you intently listen for the sound of the creature nearby, creating a terrifying experience with low visibility areas. I mentioned this before, but Subnautica uses distance really cleverly. You can hear almost about any creature from a good distance away, but it doesn't really get loud until you're really close to it, making it almost like a pseudo jump scare if you don't see it coming. And nothing can prepare you for the jump in audio for some of the more louder creatures. A great example of this is the Reaper Leviathan. It is one of the most common Leviathans, and they're often found in early game areas. Most players' first encounters with the Reaper will likely be near the crash site of the Aurora. The first encounter with the Reaper is special in setting the tone for the game. It's likely the first indication to the player that there are genuine dangers that you can't just ignore, dangers that are a lot bigger than you. And like I said, they're pretty early game as well, so it cements this idea in your head pretty fast. Near where the Reapers are located, the soundtrack that plays for that biome is usually extremely low, causing an eerie quietness that's present in not many other points in the game. And you can hear its roars from a distance, but again, when you finally get close enough to it, or more likely, it gets close enough to you, and the Reaper is no joke even in the late game. Subnautica is a game that doesn't encourage fighting, so there's very little you can do other than run from enemies. It's a reminder that while you have no help on this planet, you're not entirely alone. This planet has its own ecosystem and food chain, both of which existed way before you crash landed on the planet. And the later you get into the game, the more you realize you're lower on the food chain than you thought. Subnautica has a lot going for its sound design, stuff I could probably articulate a lot more if I knew anything technical about sound at all. For me, Subnautica uses sound to build up tension after encountering fauna, building onto the already set up atmosphere, making you always listen for sounds, especially in areas that are dead quiet with low visibility. Subnautica has some of the best sound design in gaming, and it's really a shame it doesn't get recognized for it more, especially considering I think it's what's integral to making the game scary at all. Subnautica's game design is something I hold really dear in my heart, as in my opinion it is some of the best visual and mechanical game design I've ever experienced. The atmosphere is propped up significantly with the game's visual design, and the mechanical design of the creatures benefits greatly from it, creating not only one of the most anxiety-inducing games I've ever played, but also one of the most fun worlds I've had the pleasure of exploring. The developers did an amazing job when developing the visual aspects of Subnautica, specifically the environments. The developers have stated in interviews that the visual look was supposed to be separate from the gameplay, gameplay, and this is really prevalent, and it's what makes the game so immersive in its atmosphere. You can completely ignore the story and still have a lot of fun exploring. Most of the fauna and flora are loosely based off real things on Earth, giving that uncanny feeling of something clearly alien but recognizable. The developers have also said that they were wanting to create a visual style that was not only vibrant and approachable, but also had darker tones to it as well, and I think this is what makes the environment in Subnautica so believably terrifying, as the deeper areas have those darker tones, but the vibrant feel from the early game doesn't suddenly stop existing. That same sense of wonder is still there even when faced with the creepiest parts of the game. Subnautica is a world that almost teases you into going deeper and exploring more despite its look. As the developers have said, quote, "We want players to survive. In order to do that, we're continually trying to entice them with promising new corners of the game to explore," end quote. This almost push and pull relationship Subnautica has with the player makes it a really unique experience that becomes even better when you factor in the creature design. Visually, the creatures in the game look awesome. Articles have mentioned that the designers usually start with something specific like the behaviors of Earth animals and go off of that to create the creatures, and you can see it in a lot of them in the game. The Leviathans look a lot like snakes, and the crab squids, well, that one's a bit obvious, but the point being it adds to that uncanny feel of something vaguely familiar. And I think the developers did a good job of designing the creatures with the environments in mind, making them fit naturally as if the ecosystem is real, with the creatures often matching the color palette of whatever areas they originate from, or how the developers reuse some assets in deeper areas, adding the spin of what would happen if this creature had evolved down in that part of the map. As I mentioned, the thing that comes away with the biggest benefit from all the setup of the atmosphere is the mechanical design of Subnautica. And this is due to the game really straying away from fighting back against creatures. And the game makes this clear from the start, with the knife being the only weapon able to be crafted.
Weapons were removed from standard survival blueprints following the massacre on Abraxas Prime. The knife remains the only exception.
As I've said, the creatures themselves already look and sound pretty terrifying. However, some of the creatures also have some quirks to keep you on your feet with anticipation. One of the earliest examples of this is the crashfish, which is actually one of the only hostile creatures in the safe shallows. Not really so safe if... Anyways, the Safe Shallows is the place where the player first spawns, and the crashfish inhabit the caves around this area. And the crashfish's quirk is that it somehow evolved to the point where its defense mechanism is to, upon the player getting close to the sulfur plant it lives in, make a beeline for the player and then fucking explode. Seems just a bit counterintuitive, don't you think? Anyways, this teaches the player two things early on. One, be aware of your surroundings, and two, that the fish around here don't all have the same attacks. Some of them won't just bite you, and this will prepare you for encounters later in the game, such as the crab squid. The crab squid evolved to the point where it was able to play Overwatch, decided to main Sombra, and then liked Sombra so much it actually stole her ultimate ability. It's an EMP blast that can disable your electronics. The crab squid have a lot of quirks that make it a pretty terrifying first encounter other than just its EMP. For example, crab squid attack light sources, and you as the player obviously don't know this, and crab squid are usually located in deep places, so your first encounter might be you shining your light at it for a second and it instantly aggroing onto you. It will then blast you with its EMP, leaving you even more helpless than you already are, and it does a solid 40 damage to you and your vehicles. You might think I sound mad about how these creatures have seemingly impossible abilities from an evolutionary standpoint, and while that's somewhat true, I also think that's what makes them so terrifying. You can't exactly expect something you don't believe is possible. This obviously leads to natural tension every time you see a new creature, as you try and figure out what it does, if it's aggressive, if it has rules to that aggression, if it's just an annoying little shit. Even some of the more simple attacks, such as the Reaper Leviathans, can scare you because of how the encounter is designed. The sudden change in orientation, the loud roar, your Seamoth being flung around, the health bar lowering, it's a sensory overload. Even something as simple as seeing the Ghost Leviathan suddenly start charging at you with no signs of stopping can throw someone off on the first time they see it. The mechanics of Subnautica benefit a lot from the atmosphere in order to scare you with the unnatural yet sensible quirks the creatures you encounter have. This tension creates an interesting relationship with new encounters, since it's impossible to tell if that fish over there is going to be the cutest thing in the entire game, or if it's going to explode in my face the second I touch it. In a way, the mechanical design of the creatures continue what the atmosphere started, paying off that atmosphere with creatures that fit the description perfectly, leading to one of the most immersive worlds in gaming. And this leads me into what I think is the most terrifying creature in the entire game. And I'm not going to tell you its name yet, because it kind of gives away what it does. And I also first need to explain what makes this creature so terrifying, as it uses another part of the atmosphere Subnautica sets up. A lot of survival games like to use safe spaces, giving you the ability to build a base or have a spot where enemies can't get you. Subnautica takes this a step further by not only giving you the ability to build bases almost anywhere, but the game also gives you mobile safe spaces in the form of your vehicles, the sea moth, the prawn suit, and the cyclops. And all these vehicles have their advantages and their disadvantages, but at the end of the day, they all allow for one thing: safety. They can be damaged or destroyed, but at the end of the day, you still have 1 or 2 attacks at minimum to get away from leviathans inside of them, and even more to get away from other creatures. This causes you to become attached to these vehicles. You feel vulnerable outside of them, and one creature in the game exploits this: the Warper. This creature single-handedly stopped me from beating the game for so many years. I, to this day, still find them pretty terrifying. The Warper's design, in my opinion, is the best in the game. Just by looking at it, you can tell something's off, almost like it doesn't belong, and that's before you notice the mechanical parts. Even the way it moves when you look at it from afar is pretty weird and off-putting. The Warper does what its namesake and warps you closer to it by shooting a teleportation orb at you, and then it does a massive amount of damage to you with its claws, generally being able to 2 or 3 shot you depending on how far you are in the game. And to bring it back around to the safe space discussion, these orbs can be fired at a sea moth or prawn suit and teleport you out of it, bringing you into the open waters. The Warper is, in a way, the strongest creature in the game, as it has a variety of attacks ranging from stabbing you with its claw to teleporting other aggressive fauna in the area to you. They are also one of the only creatures in the game that literally cannot die. Getting them to a certain health will result in them just warping away, coming back later with full health. Even the stasis rifles won't work on them, as Warpers can just warp out of the stasis bubbles. The Warpers have a bunch of utility at their disposal and are by far the most aggressive towards the player, making the first and even later encounters extremely tense and terrifying. I also think the Warpers have one of the coolest sounds in the game, and hearing it while it chases you only raises the tension more, as the mechanical sounds are a lot more uncomfortable compared to the other creatures in the game. In my first playthrough, I actually got really far. Regardless of how scared I was, I still made it to the inactive lava zone, the second deepest biome in the game, and one that, unbeknownst to me, has a lot of Warpers. And while exploring this biome in my prawn suit, I got warped out, causing me to take a ton of damage, not just from the initial attack, but from the heat damage from swimming back to my prawn suit, and all my stress and tension of swimming back was rewarded with being warped out again right as I got in. A feeling of helplessness overcame me as I realized I was going to die, and when I died, I realized my prawn suit and a lot of the other materials I gathered were all the way down in the lava zone, and I had no way to get there as all my vehicles were down at the lava zone entrance. It was a pretty heartbreaking realization that caused me to stop playing the game, as it was going to take hours of grinding just to get back to that spot. That experience sort of heightened my fear of everything in that game, but specifically Warpers, obviously. I ultimately couldn't work up the courage to go back down on that save, but something kept pulling me back. A year or so later, I finally started a new save file, got to the entrance of the inactive lava zone again after about 18 hours, and suddenly got a lot of anxiety. I've had moments of anxiety with Subnautica before, but this was different. I just couldn't hit the unpause button. I eventually gave up on that save file too. Yet, Subnautica always drew me back in some way, and I was always obsessed with it. Ultimately, I actually ended up beating Subnautica below 0 before I even beat the first game, and I finally ended up beating Subnautica a little over 2 weeks ago as of writing this. And when I thought back to what scared me so much when I was a kid, to some degree what still made Subnautica terrifying now, along with what made me keep coming back, and I realized it was Subnautica's atmosphere. The thing that had me so riddled with anxiety I stopped playing was also what kept me coming back. The feeling of wonder it gave me while exploring the dark, creepy, yet beautiful areas of the game. The feeling of anxiety of hearing the different sounds around me. The wonder of seeing an amazingly conceptualized alien ecosystem living and breathing despite you. Subnautica is a game that I don't think I'll have a similar experience with ever. A game that constantly pushed me away while pulling me in at the same time. And I think a lot of that was due to the atmosphere Subnautica sets for itself, and it's what makes the game so terrifyingly beautiful. Where playing it today, I can't help but admire the things that still make tension rise in me. The things that still cause me to pause the game and take a step back. The things that still bring the wonder of discovering something new. What keeps bringing me back to Subnautica? My desire to keep exploring this world they've created. My desire to love this world they've created. and even my desire to still be terrified of this world they've created. I think I can still chalk up a lot of why I was scared of this game to just being a wuss. But I also think the game created the perfect environment and atmosphere for a feeling like that to thrive. And that is what makes Subnautica the king of atmosphere. Hey, I actually managed to upload a video during the summer for once. Subnautica is probably my favorite game of all time, and this video does mean a lot to me, and I hope you enjoyed it. This video took a bit longer than I expected, as I got laryngitis like halfway through, and that put me out of commission for like a month. The next video will hopefully come out in September, October-ish. It just depends on when the Flyers finish their off-season, and I'm bringing back the off-season review videos. As of this recording, the draft is like 2 days away, and I've never been more optimistic about the Flyers in my entire life. Danny Briere is just an amazing GM, or maybe he's just an average GM. I honestly can't tell after having Chuck Fletcher for like 5 years. Anyways, follow me on Twitter for random tweets about random stuff, and as always, I hope you have a dandy rest of your day.